Sangre de Cristo Conspiracy. Chapter 6. The Scholar's Apprehension. The Garcia house was a respectable, if somewhat faded, adobe dwelling on a quiet street just south of the bustling Taos Plaza. Unlike the imposing Montoya hacienda or the commercial hub of Elena Vasquez's trading post, it exuded an air of quiet domesticity. Flowers, mostly hardy marigolds and zinnias, bloomed in profusion in the small courtyard, and the scent of roasting chilies emanated from an unseen kitchen, a comforting, everyday aroma that felt worlds away from the grim business Marshall Hartwell was pursuing. He knocked on the sturdy wooden door, which was opened by a stout, aproned woman with kind eyes and flour dusting her sleeves. This was Senora Garcia, known for her clean rooms and her discretion, qualities that made her boarding house a preferred stop for more discerning travelers.
Marshal Hartwell,
she said, her initial surprise giving way to a welcoming smile.
It is an honor. Please come in. What brings you to my humble home?
Buenas tardes, Senor Garcia, Hartwell replied, removing his hat. I'm told you have a guest staying with you, Mr. Abernathy. I'd like to have a word with him, if he's available. Senora Garcia's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of curiosity entered her eyes.
See, Mr. Abernathy is in his room, a quiet gentleman, always with his books. He takes his meals alone, mostly. Is there any trouble, Marshal?
Just a routine inquiry, Senora, Hartwell reassured her. Part of a larger investigation, nothing for you to worry about. She nodded, though her gaze lingered on him for a moment before she led him through a cool, dark hallway to a door at the back of the house.
This is the room, Marshal. He should be within.
She rapped lightly on the door.
Mr. Abernathy, you have a visitor. Marshal Hartwell.
Then a shuffling sound from within, followed by a reedy voice.
A visitor? Marshal Hartwell, one moment, please.
The door opened a crack, and a pair of spectacles appeared, followed by a thin, bird-like face. Mr. Abernathy was perhaps in his late 50s, with wispy gray hair combed neatly over a balding pate. He wore a slightly ink-stained linen shirt and a worried expression. His room, visible past his shoulder, was indeed dominated by books, stacked on every available surface, alongside rolled maps, scattered notes, and what looked like charcoal rubbings of stone inscriptions.
Marshal Hartwell?
Abernathy asked, his voice betraying a slight tremor. He opened the door wider, though he still seemed to fill the entryway, as if reluctant to allow full access. Mr. Abernathy? Hartwell said, his tone mild. May I come in? I have a few questions for you. It concerns an investigation I'm conducting into the death of Don Carlos Montoya. Abernathy's eyes widened behind his spectacles, and he seemed to shrink back a little.
Don Carlos? Dead? Oh, my heavens. That's dreadful news. Terrible tragedy. Please, Marshal, do come in. Though I fear my humble lodgings are rather cluttered.
He stepped aside, and Hartwell entered the small room. It was indeed crammed with the detritus of scholarly pursuit. The air smelled of old paper, dust, and the faint, sweet aroma of pipe tobacco. Hartwell noted a half-packed valise in one corner, as if Abernathy was either in the midst of settling in or preparing for a departure. "You knew Don Carlos Montoya, sir?" Hartwell asked, his gaze taking in the titles of some of the books. Histories of New Spain, treatises on colonial art, Pueblo ethnographies.
"Knew him? Not well, Marshal. Not well at all."
Abernathy demurred, fussing with a stack of papers on his small writing desk.
I had occasion to consult with him once, very briefly, regarding access to some territorial archives. He was helpful, in his way. But his death, you say? How did it happen?
"He was murdered, Mr. Abernathy, at his hacienda 2 nights ago." Hartwell watched the man's reaction. Abernathy sank onto the edge of his narrow cot, his face paling.
"Murdered? Good heavens! This is a violent land, Marshal. More violent than I had anticipated."
He wrung his hands, his gaze darting around the room as if seeking an escape route. "You're a historian, I understand. Researching the history of this region?"
Yes, a humble scholar, Marshal,"
Abernathy affirmed, seeming to latch on to the familiar subject with some relief.
"My interest lies primarily in the early Spanish colonial period. The establishment of the missions, the interaction between the Spanish settlers and the indigenous Pueblo cultures. A fascinating, though often brutal period."
"Indeed," Hartwell said. "Did your research ever lead you to inquire about the Sangre de Cristo cache?" Abernathy blinked.
The Sangre de Cristo cache?
He gave a nervous little laugh.
"Oh, the legendary treasure? One hears whispers of it, but of course. Local folklore, tales of conquistador gold hidden during the revolt. Every region has such stories, Marshal. Romantic, but usually more fiction than fact."
"Don Carlos Montoya believed it was very much a fact, Mr. Abernathy. He claimed to have found it. And now it's missing. Along with his life." The scholar's Adam's apple bobbed.
"Missing, you say? The entire cache? That is astonishing. If it truly existed, its value must be immense."
"My investigation has led me to believe that there are several parties interested in such a find. The Mexican government, the church, certain old Spanish families." Hartwell paused, then added, "And it appears private collectors of artifacts. I'm looking for a man, an American, who calls himself Mr. Smith. Sandy hair, nervous demeanor. He was seen speaking with Don Carlos about acquiring certain items." Abernathy was silent for a long moment, staring at his ink-stained fingers. He seemed to be wrestling with some internal debate. Finally, he looked up, his expression earnest.
"Marshal,"
he began, his voice barely above a whisper.
I may have encountered the gentleman you describe, or someone very like him."
Hartwell kept his expression neutral, though his interest quickened. "Oh? When? And where was this, Mr. Abernathy?"
"A few days ago in the plaza. He approached me. Noticed I was sketching some architectural details of the old church. He introduced himself as Smith. Asked about my research. When I mentioned my interest in colonial era artifacts, he became quite intense. He inquired if I knew of any significant items that might be available for acquisition by discerning collectors. He spoke of wanting to preserve these items to ensure they were appreciated in the proper collections back east.
This matched Montoya's journal and Elena's observations perfectly. And what did you tell him, Mr. Abernathy?
I told him I was a scholar, Marshal, not a purveyor of antiques. I confess, his manner made me uneasy. There was a certain rapaciousness about him, a hunger in his eyes that belied his talk of preservation. I disengaged from the conversation as quickly as possible.
Did he mention Don Carlos Montoya or the Sangre de Cristo cache?
No,
Abernathy shook his head.
No, not specifically. His inquiries were more general, but he did ask if I knew of anyone locally who might have access to such items. Someone who might be persuaded to part with them.
And, did you suggest anyone?
I, may have mentioned that Don Carlos Montoya, as a prominent official and a man known to be interested in local history, might be someone to consult regarding territorial archives or historical matters. It was an innocent suggestion, Marshal. I assure you, I had no idea.
Did, Smith say where he was staying? Or who he was working for?
No, he was very discreet. Almost secretive. He implied he had powerful backers, wealthy men who understood the true value of such things.
Abernathy hesitated.
There was one other thing, Marshal. After our conversation, I saw him later that day, speaking with a man who looked like one of the rougher American trappers. A big man, bearded. They were in a quiet corner of the cantina. Their heads together, it seemed an odd pairing. The nervous Mr. Smith, and such a frontiersman.
A big, bearded trapper. Eli, Baird, Thompson. Immediately it came to Hartwell's mind. If Smith was trying to acquire artifacts and potentially needed help moving or guarding them, aligning himself with someone who knew the mountains and had a network of tough men would make a grim sort of sense. This trapper, Mr. Abernathy, would you recognize him again?
I believe so, Marshal. He was quite distinctive, very large. As I said, he had a scar, I think, on his left cheek.
That detail didn't immediately confirm Thompson, but it was something to file away. Hartwell leaned forward slightly. Mr. Abernathy, your valise is partially packed. Were you planning on leaving Taos soon? Abernathy flushed.
Well, yes, Marshal. My research here, it's become rather uncomfortable. After hearing about Don Carlos, this town suddenly feels less welcoming. I thought perhaps a change of scenery, Santa Fe, perhaps, or even a return to the east.
I'd appreciate it if you'd postpone your travel plans for a few days, Mr. Abernathy, Hartwell said, his voice polite but firm. You may have further information that could be useful as my investigation progresses. Abernathy swallowed, looking distinctly unhappy, but nodded.
Of course, Marshal, whatever you require. I wish only to assist the cause of justice.
One last thing, sir. In your research into the old Spanish families, have you come across any particular names that are repeatedly associated with claims to lost treasures or artifacts from the colonial era? Families who might feel particularly aggrieved if such items were found and not returned to them?
Abernathy frowned in thought, tapping a finger against his lips. The Romeros, certainly, their family archives, or what remains of them. are said to contain documents alluding to land grants and properties that included items of significant historical and monetary value, lost during the upheavals. Don Diego Romero, the current patriarch, is a man steeped in the history of his ancestors. He speaks often of restoring the family's rightful heritage. He paused. And then there are De la Guerras, a lesser name now, perhaps, but in the 17th century, they were exceptionally powerful. Legend has it that the De la Guerra Knight was entrusted with safeguarding a portion of the mission treasures during the revolt. Some say he failed, others that he secreted them away so cunningly they were never found. His knowledge dying with him. De la Guerra. A new name. Hartwell made a mental note. He rose, collecting his hat. Thank you for your time, Mr. Abernathy. You've been most helpful. I may have more questions for you later. I shall be here, Marshal, Abernathy said, rising as well, though he still looked shaken. He escorted Hartwell to the door, relief evident on his face as the Marshal stepped back into the hallway. Outside the Garcia house, the late afternoon air was cooling rapidly. Hartwell paused, considering his next move. Abernathy, despite his nervousness, had provided several crucial pieces of information. He had confirmed Smith's presence and his unsavory interest in artifacts. He had linked Smith, however tenuously, to a figure who sounded suspiciously like Bear Thompson, and he had offered another name from the roster of the old families, De la Guerra, adding another layer to the complex claims surrounding the cache. The scholar's fear seemed genuine enough, but Hartwell couldn't shake the feeling that Abernathy might know more than he was letting on, or perhaps was more involved in the periphery of these events than he admitted. The half-packed valise was suggestive. For now, the connection between the smooth-talking Mr. Smith and the rough-hewn mountain men was the most pressing thread. If they were indeed working together, it suggested a conspiracy with both brains and brawn, capable of locating, stealing, and transporting a treasure as significant as the Sangre de Cristo cache, and capable of murder to achieve their ends. His path was leading him, inexorably, towards the mountain men. And that meant, sooner or later, confrontation with Eli Bear Thompson. But that would require careful planning. Thompson was not a man to be approached rashly. Perhaps a visit to Don Diego Romero first, to gauge the temper of the old families, would be a prudent next step. It would give him more pieces to lay on the table before he faced the enigma of the mountain man.